Hey, this is Clark, and I've been reading a book called 10, something about 10 Rules of the Red Sea or the Red Sea Rules, something like that by Robert Morgan. And it's Exodus chapter 14, and I was kind of taking some notes along that. So some of these thoughts come from that book, but the main point wasn't really necessarily his main point. I was going to just kind of go through Exodus chapter 14 and look at what the children of Israel here. Literally, God leads them into this difficulty, which is the first point that Morgan brings out in this book, and it says, then, so this is how it starts in Exodus chapter 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Piharoth, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal-zephon. You shall encamp facing it by the sea. So the point is, as the children of Israel are coming out of Egypt, after 400 years, that they were in Egypt as slaves. Of course, they weren't originally as slaves necessarily. They were, the Pharaoh, when he let Joseph's family come in, they weren't necessarily that way. But over the years, they forgot who Joseph was, and they become slaves. And so for 400 years, now consider this, because I was just discussing this with someone the other day. When you think about it, this is longer than uh, people have been other than Native Americans, it's longer than the people have been in the United States, or about the same length of time. If you consider Jamestown the first settlement in 1608, it's been a little over 400 years, and that's about how long the children of Israel were in Egypt. So for them to come out, this was a huge deal. It's easy for us to look at them and say, I can't believe they didn't want to come out, but this was a long time. And God, when He leads them out, He brings them, literally, He changes plans. If you look back to Exodus chapter 3, and then where they were going to go, and then in chapter 14, and where He tells them to go, it's almost like they change plans, and He sends them into this almost a cul-de-sac where basically they would be sitting ducks. So God put them in it. Basically, He put them in a trap. And the thought being that the problems we go through, the suffering you go through, is ordained by God. And that may sound rough, and some of it we bring on ourselves. For instance, if you have cancer of your jaw and you've chewed tobacco for 40 years, then possibly you've brought some of that on yourself. And that's just an example. But some things obviously we bring on ourselves, but a lot of suffering we go through, God is bringing us for a certain point. Maybe He's trying to teach us something. Or in this situation, as you see in verse number 3, continues, and in verse 4 says, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host. So God did this knowing He's going to lead them out to get the glory from it. He wants Pharaoh to see this. He wants Pharaoh and his people to understand this. He wants them to see this witness that He is God. So as you continue on, as I've said, some other things that Morgan points out as he's writing this book. For instance, consider prayer. When it gets to verse number 10, it says, and down toward the end, says, and the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. So in this time when they were brought into this place of suffering, they literally cried out. They prayed to the Lord. And this is what the people say to Moses. Now, it would be hard to handle knowing what Moses went through, and hopefully you know the story of Moses, but literally they would come to him. And for instance, here in verse number 11, it says, they said to him, what have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? And they went on to say, it would be better, it said, it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. That would be hard to handle, knowing what Moses went through and what he's going through now to get them out, and even knowing how God brought them here to show Pharaoh His glory. And so they said it would have been better. And then, of course, Moses gives them this speech and says, he tells them this, and this is an awesome statement, not what I'm going to here, but just as I'm going there. It says, the Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. This is Moses telling the people. A confident speech, great speech, but then God answers him, and this is what I want you to see. It says, the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry to me? So now we can take this a couple ways. Number one, it said they cried out. So I think he's saying, basically he's saying stop praying. So he said, why are you doing this? Stop crying. It's not really like they're crying like a baby. And he said, stop being a baby and stop crying. He's just saying, Stop crying out to me. Stop praying to me and tell the people of Israel to go forward. And so this is the word of encouragement, of motivation today. Just go forward. I don't know what you're going through, but just go forward. And really, a side point out of this is there is a point when God says, stop praying. But he says that in essence, instead of praying, move forward. As A.W. Tozer said, if you're in your secret place praying for the widows, God won't be one bit upset if you stop praying and go help the widows. And so I think that is an awesome lesson here. And I'm not covering all the points that was in this book that I was talking about, but stop here. And the point being that we, no matter what you're up against, just keep going forward. And I think we all know what that means. Obviously, that we know things that aren't the Lord's will, and we know things that are always the Lord's will. It's always the Lord's will to pray, even though we saw where there's, in this sense, he says just move forward. It's always the Lord's will to talk about Him. It's always the Lord's will, to do these things, to be in community, talking about Him, these things, sort of things. But just move forward. You may be in a place where you don't feel like you can, but just move forward. If anything, I think that the last couple of years has taught us is no matter what happens, just move forward. Just continue to move forward. Put any comments down in the YouTube. I'll be glad to get back with you. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe. Until next time.